праздником вас! С Днем Великой Победы! Ура!
Уважаемые граждане, проход в сторону метро Луганска закрыт.
Vladimir Putin once seemed to possess supernatural invulnerability. He was hailed as the leader who raised Russia from the ruins of the 1990s.
Владимир Путин!
Thwarted the West's strategic moves and reshaped the global balance with energy. But today, the order Putin established is no longer as rigid as armor. At the heart of this collapse lies a single breaking point: the war in Ukraine.
О проведении специальной военной операции.
The war would be short. That's what Russian generals said. Kiev would fall in a matter of days, Europe would split, and the US would stay away. Putin had set the stage for this great moment, which would crown his career.
Была создана Россией.
But that stage collapsed the moment he stepped onto it. For this war became a turning point, where not only tanks, but the very veins of a country burst. The army could not keep pace with the technological warfare of the modern age. The economy became unable to breathe under the pressure of sanctions. Society was left adrift amid opaque governance and propaganda. And perhaps most crucially, the people's psyche eroded under constant conflict, uncertainty, and isolation. Today, on the brink of the abyss, Russians no longer wonder only when the war will end, but when their lives can return to normal. And this questioning is increasingly turning into anger. The people who once stood firmly behind Putin have now turned their backs on him. The hands that waved flags in the early days of the war are now clenched in fists, thinking about their children's future. Of this giant country of 143 million, 80 million no longer believe in their leader's war. They want peace. A comprehensive survey published by the independent Levada Center in August 2025 starkly revealed this attitude. Only 27% of those surveyed believe Moscow should continue its military operations in Ukraine. This is the lowest level of support recorded since the war began in February 2022. In contrast, a record 66% majority stated that peace negotiations with Kiev should begin. This is not merely a change of opinion, it is also the silent echo of a trauma. Indeed, 58% of participants stated that they have directly felt the impact of the war. 3 out of 10 have lost a relative or acquaintance in the fighting. A similar proportion say a family member or close friend is still at the front. These figures show that the war is no longer just in the news, but is being lived in homes, at dinner tables, and in memories. The survey results also reveal who determines social support and how. The highest support for peace talks is observed among women and young people under the age of 24. 73% of rural residents agree that the war must end. Among those who disapprove of Putin's presidency, this figure reaches a crushing majority of 82%. Furthermore, access to information and media usage have become decisive factors in perceptions of the war. Among participants who have turned their backs on traditional state television and get their news from YouTube and independent digital media, calls for peace resonate much more strongly. This group, which does not embrace the government's official narrative, also includes those who believe Russia is heading in the wrong direction. In contrast, the segment that wants the war to continue is smaller and more distinct. 38% of male participants, 35% of Russians over the age of 55, 47% of Moscow residents, and 30% of those who still approve of Putin believe the conflict should continue. Although support is relatively higher among state television viewers, even these figures show that the influence of the Kremlin's fully controlled media power is gradually eroding. However, what is most striking is that we have entered a period where those who want the war to end are no longer just saying it quietly. They have started to speak out loud. The most defining threshold of this dark period is that the war is now being felt not only on the front lines, but directly in the homes, kitchens, wallets, and psyches of Russian citizens. Inflation is no longer a murmur hidden behind official figures, but an alarm echoing in every street and every market. This rate, shown as 9% on paper, gives way to a much more devastating reality in daily life. Because these figures are not reflected in the Russian people's refrigerators, these figures, which have no counterpart on price tags, are now seen as a deception in the eyes of the people. The annual price increase for food has exceeded 10.79%. However, Even this rate is not enough to hide the pain it contains. Because today, food is no longer a necessity for millions of Russians, but a luxury. The most basic products such as bread, milk, butter, and eggs have become unaffordable. Especially for retired workers, families living on a single income, and minimum wage workers. A loaf of bread, which cost 15 rubles at the end of 2022, exceeded 40 rubles in mid-2025. The price of just 1 kilo of potatoes has tripled compared to last year. This increase is now measured not in numbers, but in every bite missing from the table. Even a simple plate of food has become a difficult-to-reach symbol. Products like meat, cheese, and yogurt are driving people to despair, not only because of their high cost, but also because they are simply unavailable. The shelves of chain stores are constantly empty. Sudden price jumps for products such as eggs and vegetables completely wipe out the small breathing space a low-income family has at the beginning of the month within a few days. Let's imagine an ordinary Russian family of 4. The salary starts to be divided before it even reaches your hands. The first blow comes from housing expenses. Rent, maintenance fees, electricity, natural gas, water, waste disposal taxes. By the first days of the month, a third of the salary has evaporated. Then comes the kitchen. Basic food products now consume 35 to 40% of the budget. When products such as meat or milk are added, this percentage approaches 50%. Life isn't just about bills. When schools open, there are stationary expenses. When winter sets in, new boots for the children. Unexpected healthcare costs. None of these are luxuries, but all of them together create holes in the budget, and those holes fuel an unbreakable cycle of poverty. In some areas, families can only afford to give their children a few slices of stale bread and unsweetened tea for breakfast. Retirees struggle to get through the last days of the month on just water and pasta. In the back streets of cities, people searching through supermarket trash for uneaten food are no longer the exception. Every day there are more. Saving is just a dream in this scenario. It's no longer a matter of putting something aside. Just making ends meet is considered an achievement, because a single unexpected bill is enough to upset the entire balance. Rather than finding solutions, the strategy of postponement has become a way of life. People are turning to credit cards, installment purchases, and consumer loans. Passing today's burden on to tomorrow is a survival reflex. But as interest rates rise, debt comes at a price. Debt servicing, i.e., monthly installment payments, has become a fixed part of the monthly salary. As this fragile cycle continues, the inevitable outcome begins: the erosion of the middle class. Families who once could afford vacations, save money, and educate their children now plan their lives around weekly discount catalogs. Unfortunately, in the midst of this severe economic crisis, people are not only losing their livelihoods but also their loved ones. Since the start of the war, over 1 million Russian soldiers have lost their lives. The streets are now filled with the silent echo of this pain. Gravediggers, forced to dig in the frozen winter ground, are at work from the capital to the most remote villages. Coffins covered with plastic sheets are unloaded at small-town train stations and handed over to families. Some mothers greet their sons' coffins with tears, while some fathers crumple and throw away the papers that say martyred. Because for them, these deaths are not the silent farewell of a state, but of a child. The voices of the crying mothers and angry brothers may not be heard on television, but they echo on social media, in telegram groups, and in notes left on cemetery walls. The war took our son from us, and now it won't even tell us why. They give us bread with ration cards, but they transport the coffins for free. These losses bring not only physical, but also psychological devastation. A person struggling with poverty pins their hopes on their family, on their children. But this war buries not only people's futures, but also their pasts. Because many households now mourn not only a loaf of bread, but also their children. This mourning is also mourning for Russia's demographic future. In February 2025, only 90,500 births were recorded nationwide in Russia. This is one of the lowest monthly birth rates in modern history. Meanwhile, deaths are much higher during the same period, and the country is rapidly sliding toward a demographic cliff with its aging population and declining fertility rates. In 2023, the total fertility rate was 1.41 children per woman. This is well below the 2.1 level required for the population to replace itself. This is because, In the eyes of the average Russian family, having children is no longer an ideal, but a risky investment. People have not forgotten the economic collapse of the 1990s. The uncertainty, poverty, and social collapse of that period left deep scars on the collective memory. Today, the feeling that a similar atmosphere is emerging again is the main factor threatening the future of new children. Without economic stability, without social security, without the rule of law, people do not want to have children. And the Kremlin knows this. But despite this, instead of the fundamental solution of ending the war and establishing long-term social security, it is trying to gloss over the issue with superficial policies. The Birth Capital Program, which came into effect in 2007, achieved short-term success. It increased fertility per woman by 0.15, but this increase coincided only with the oil boom period between 2008 and 2012. During this brief period of economic confidence, some couples chose to have their second child a little earlier. When oil revenues declined, the Kremlin tried other approaches. It attempted to restrict access to abortion. It introduced a requirement for gynecologist approval for pregnancy. In 2024, child-free life propaganda was banned. Cash payments were offered to pregnant high school students. A reality show called Mom at 16 was aired to encourage young girls to give birth at an early age. Such initiatives make headlines, but they do not produce babies, because these policies do not address the deep social and economic problems underlying the demographic decline. Today, the Russian state no longer shares monthly birth data. This is a silent but clear admission of the seriousness of the situation. The state has realized that the future is so bleak that it must be hidden from the public. And instead of facing the numbers, it tries to cover it up with rhetoric. While the number of children born in Russia is declining, up to 14 million migrant workers are employed in the country. The majority of these workers come from countries such as Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. In these countries, fertility rates are still around 3, and young men can earn more than in their own countries, despite low wages in Russia. Migrants not only work but also bring their families with them. Migrant communities have become permanent, especially in Moscow and its surroundings. In some areas, Russian is no longer the dominant language on the streets, and this fundamentally shakes the perception of an ethnic Russian majority in the country. In the near future, if trends continue, Russia will have 25 to 30 million migrants of Asian origin. When the high birth rate in the North Caucasus is added to this, Orthodox Slavs will cease to be the ethnic majority. Russian will become just one of the languages spoken on city buses. This scenario poses an existential threat to a state built on the ideal of an empire. However, instead of confronting this threat, the Kremlin continues to spin tales of the traditional family. Without migrant workers, construction sites would grind to a halt, tax revenues would decline, pension funds would collapse, the army would be unable to find soldiers, and this situation creates a major contradiction with the government's official rhetoric. While presenting a nationalist and traditionalist stance to the outside world, domestic policy relies on migrant labor for the system to function. Yet despite this bleak landscape, the Kremlin seems to be living in another universe. While state television still airs reports of triumphant fronts, in reality, coffins are arriving faster and funerals are being buried more quietly. As the bonds holding society together unravel, the state's only priority is not to lose control. Denial was the Putin administration's first reflex. As the people's calls for peace grew louder, the state clung to the rhetoric of patriotism. The war was described as an existential struggle for Russia. However, this rhetoric no longer matches the reality experienced by the people, because everyone sees the collapse of their own lives every morning in the mirror, in the kitchen, at the market, and in the empty chairs. Censorship has become the shield of this denial. Media outlets cannot use the word war, and those calling for peace on social media platforms are accused of treason. Only channels with a few thousand members on Telegram can share the real death toll, voices from the front lines, and military failures. But even this information is not enough to curb the people's growing anger. Propaganda is like a bright but empty colored blanket thrown over this wreckage. State television still claims that Ukraine is about to collapse, that the West is falling apart, and that the Russian people are fulfilling their historic duty, but the people are no longer buying it. Because while propaganda spills from the screens, empty pots in kitchens, gasoline rationed by coupon, and elderly people struggling with deprivation scream the truth. The state's new policy is no longer just to lie, but to intimidate the people into silence. Anti-war demonstrations have been banned, Telegram channels have been infiltrated, and users accused of supporting Ukraine on social media have been arrested. But for every voice that is silenced, another echoes back. So what do you think about this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching.